Yesterday, the World Bank released a report stating that energy prices are projected to surge 24% this year to their highest level since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that the war in the Middle East has triggered the largest oil supply shock on record, with an initial reduction in global oil supply of approximately 10 million barrels per day. That is not a projection from a blog. That is the World Bank, published yesterday, April 28, 2026. And buried inside that report was a sentence that should have stopped every financial network in its tracks. Under the World Bank's escalation scenario, Brent oil prices could average as high as $115 per barrel in 2026 if critical oil and gas facilities suffer more damage and export volumes are slow to recover. And then 19 hours ago, CNBC reported that Brent crude settled at $111.26 per barrel after Trump told his advisors he is not satisfied with Iran's proposal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The escalation scenario is no longer a scenario. It is the current price. And the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in their April short-term energy outlook, independently forecast that Brent will peak at $115 per barrel in the second quarter of 2026. We are in the second quarter of 2026, right now, and the EIA's forecast was published on April 7th, before the ceasefire collapsed, before the Islamabad talks failed, before Trump declared the naval blockade, before Iran seized 2 container ships in the Strait last week, and before the UAE announced it was leaving OPEC starting Friday. Every development since April 7th has made the EIA's $115 forecast look conservative. The IEA's April oil market report, published 2 weeks ago, documented that physical crude oil prices had already surged to record levels near $150 per barrel in the spot market, far above futures prices, as refiners scrambled to replace locked-in Middle Eastern cargoes. North Sea-dated crude was trading at $130 per barrel, $60 above pre-conflict levels. The futures price says $111. The physical price, the price that refineries actually pay to obtain crude oil and turn it into gasoline and diesel and jet fuel, already hit $150. And the gap between what the futures market says and what the physical market is actually doing is the widest it has ever been. That disconnect means the price at your gas pump has not yet reflected what is actually happening in the global oil market. It will, and when it does, the number on the pump will be one that most Americans have never seen before. This is just the beginning. And I need you to understand why I use those words, because what you have seen so far, the $4 gas, the 0.9% monthly CPI spike, the ceasefire theater, is the first wave. The World Bank identified 3 distinct waves. First, energy prices. Second, food prices. Third, inflation that pushes up interest rates and makes debt more expensive. We are in the transition between Wave 1 and Wave 2 right now. Wave 1 hit in March with the energy CPI spiking 10.9%. Wave 2, the food price surge driven by fertilizer costs, diesel costs, and supply chain disruption, is loading into the system right now and will arrive at the grocery shelf within 60 days. Wave 3, the monetary policy response where the Fed is forced to hold rates or even raise them to fight the inflation that the war created, has not started yet. Each wave is larger than the last because each wave compounds on the one before it. Higher energy costs make food more expensive. More expensive food pushes inflation higher. Higher inflation forces higher interest rates. Higher interest rates make mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, and business borrowing more expensive. And more expensive borrowing slows the economy into the recession territory that the IMF just warned about. The World Bank's chief economist stated that the poorest people who spend the highest share of their income on food and fuels will be hit the hardest. In the United States, the bottom 40% of households by income spend approximately 25 to 35% of their after-tax income on food and energy combined. The top 20% spend approximately 10 to 12%. A 24% surge in energy prices and a 31% surge in fertilizer prices hit the bottom 40% 3 times harder than the top 20% as a share of their budget. The war is a regressive tax levied on the American consumer by a conflict they never authorized and cannot escape. Global oil supply just dropped by 10 million barrels per day, and that number is larger than the entire output of Saudi Arabia. Read that headline again and let it register. 10 million barrels per day, gone. The IEA's April oil market report documented that global oil supply plummeted by 10.1 million barrels per day in March to 97 million barrels per day, driven by continued attacks on energy infrastructure in the Middle East and ongoing restrictions to tanker movements through the Strait of Hormuz. OPEC plus production alone fell 9.4 million barrels per day month over month. For scale, Saudi Arabia produces approximately 9 million barrels per day. The supply disruption in a single month was larger than the total daily production of the largest oil exporter on Earth. And the IEA described it in their own words as the largest disruption in history. Not the largest since the 1970s, not the largest since the Iraq War, the largest in history. Larger than the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which removed approximately 5 million barrels per day and triggered a quadrupling of oil prices and a global recession. Larger than the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which removed approximately 4 million barrels per day. Larger than Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which removed approximately 4.3 million barrels per day. The current disruption is more than double the size of any previous oil supply shock in the modern era. And the infrastructure damage is not temporary. More than 80 energy facilities across the Gulf were damaged, with more than a third severely damaged according to the IEA. Saudi Arabia's largest refinery was hit by drone attacks. Qatar's LNG export facilities were targeted. Pipelines connecting Iraqi production fields to export terminals were damaged. Andy Lapau, president of Lapau Oil Associates, told CNBC that even if hostilities ended immediately, a return to normal market conditions would take 4 to 6 months, citing the need to clear mines, ease tanker congestion, and gradually restart production and refining. And the EIA's own forecast assumes that production shut-ins will only fall to 6.7 million barrels per day by May and will not return close to pre-conflict levels until late 2030, 6 months minimum. At best, with oil prices elevated the entire time. Refiners are paying $150 per barrel in the physical market, and your gas pump hasn't caught up yet. Here is the detail that should terrify you more than any other number in this video. The IEA reported that physical crude oil prices surged to record levels near $150 per barrel as oil importing nations scrambled to source replacement barrels from an increasingly shrinking pool of supply. North Sea dated crude, the benchmark that European refineries use to price the actual physical oil they purchase, was trading at approximately $130 per barrel, $60 above pre-conflict levels. And in Asia, where refineries are most dependent on Middle Eastern crude, the scramble was even more severe. The IEA documented that Middle East and feedstock-constrained refineries in Asia have cut runs by approximately 6 million barrels per day to 77.2 million barrels per day. Global crude throughputs, the amount of oil that refineries are actually processing, are now expected to decline by 1 million barrels per day on average in 2026. Less oil being processed means less gasoline being produced, less diesel being produced. And the physical futures disconnect that the IEA documented means that the price the refinery paid for its oil today is dramatically higher than what the futures market suggests. Futures contracts are financial instruments traded on screens. Physical oil is actual crude loaded onto tankers and delivered to refineries. And when the physical market diverges from the futures market by $20 to $40 per barrel, it means the spot price of actual oil is dramatically higher than what the headline price on CNBC suggests. The refinery that paid $150 per barrel for its crude last week is going to produce gasoline and diesel at a cost that reflects $150, not the $111 that Brent futures closed at yesterday. And when that gasoline arrives at the wholesale terminal and then at the gas station pump, the price will reflect the refinery's actual input cost, not the futures headline. Americans are looking at Brent at $111 and thinking that is the price of oil. It is not. It is the price of a futures contract. The price of actual oil, the oil that becomes the gasoline in your car, already hit $150 in the spot market. And the lag between the spot market and the gas pump is approximately 2 to 4 weeks. Which means the $4.15 per gallon national average that the AAA reported during the ceasefire is about to climb significantly higher as the physical market prices flow through to retail. The EIA's own forecast projects retail gasoline prices will remain particularly elevated, with diesel even worse due to tight global supplies and U.S. inventories remaining below the 5-year average. And the EIA noted something that almost no mainstream outlet has explained to the public. The Brent WTI spread, the difference between the international benchmark and the U.S. benchmark, peaked at $15 per barrel in April. That spread exists because Brent is more exposed to global crude oil market conditions, including the increase in transportation costs exacerbated by the Hormuz disruption. A $15 spread means that even though WTI crude is trading at $93 to $100, the oil that determines the marginal cost of refined products in the global market is $15 higher. And because the United States is integrated into the global refined products market, importing significant quantities of diesel and jet fuel from European and Asian refineries that price their crude at Brent, not WTI. The international price is the price that ultimately matters for American consumers. The domestic production advantage that should theoretically insulate the U.S. from global price spikes is partially negated by the fact that American refineries export refined products at world prices, and American consumers compete with global buyers for the same barrel of diesel. Cheap domestic crude does not automatically produce cheap domestic gasoline when the global market is paying $130 for physical barrels. The refiner will sell to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder right now is a desperate Asian refinery that lost its Middle Eastern feedstock and is willing to pay any price to keep its operations running. The EIA also documented a critical dynamic that is making the crisis worse inside the United States, even as domestic production remains near record levels. The Brent crude oil price increased more sharply than WTI because Brent is more exposed to global conditions, including higher transportation costs, exacerbated by the Hormuz disruption. To soften domestic price impacts, the U.S.
government announced a 60-day Jones Act waiver on March 17th to allow foreign vessels to transport commodities between U.S. ports.
The fact that the federal government was forced to waive a 100-year-old maritime law to facilitate domestic fuel distribution tells you how severe the logistics breakdown has become. The Jones Act waiver is an emergency measure. It is the maritime equivalent of a FEMA declaration. It signals that normal supply chain mechanisms have failed and that the government is intervening directly in the physical movement of fuel within the country's own borders. And even with the waiver, diesel supplies remain tight. The EIA reported that U.S. diesel inventories are remaining below the 5-year average. In 2022, diesel inventories fell to a 70-year low without a major Middle East war. With a major Middle East war, the inventories are approaching levels that could produce regional spot shortages, particularly on the East Coast, which depends on Gulf Coast refineries for the bulk of its distillate supply. Fertilizer prices just jumped 31%, and urea surged 60%, and your grocery bill is about to absorb every dollar of it. The World Bank's Commodity Markets Outlook published yesterday projected that fertilizer prices will increase by 31% in 2026, driven by a 60% jump in urea prices. Urea is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer in the world. It is synthesized from natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process, which means its price is directly linked to the price of natural gas, which is directly linked to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of global LNG flows. When the strait closed, LNG supply was disrupted. When LNG supply was disrupted, natural gas prices spiked. When natural gas prices spiked, fertilizer production costs surged. When fertilizer costs surged, the input cost of growing every calorie of food that depends on synthetic nitrogen, which is effectively all grain, all corn, all rice, all wheat, all soybeans, surged with it. And the 60% jump in urea prices is not a forecast for next year. It is a forecast for this year. 2026. The planting season in the American Midwest is happening right now. Farmers are making input purchasing decisions right now, and the fertilizer they are buying right now costs 60% more than it did in January. That cost will be embedded in the price of the grain they harvest in September and October. It will be embedded in the price of the feed that goes to cattle, hogs, and poultry. It will be embedded in the price of the corn that goes into ethanol, which is blended into gasoline. It will be embedded in the price of the soybeans that go into cooking oil, animal feed, and biofuel. Every step of the American food chain runs through fertilizer, and fertilizer just became 31% more expensive because of a war that the American public never voted for and a strait closure that the American military has been unable to reverse in 2 months of trying. The World Bank's chief economist Indermit Gill stated it plainly in yesterday's report. He said the war is hitting the global economy in cumulative waves, first through higher energy prices, then higher food prices, and finally higher inflation, which will push up interest rates and make debt even more expensive. 3 waves. The first wave has already hit. The second wave is arriving at the farm gate right now and will arrive at the grocery shelf in 60 to 90 days. The third wave, the interest rate response, has not yet begun, but it will, because a Federal Reserve that is watching CPI climb from 2.4% in January to 3.3% in March to potentially 4% or higher by summer cannot cut rates without losing all remaining credibility on inflation. The rate cuts that were supposed to bring relief to mortgage holders, credit card holders, auto loan borrowers, and small businesses are gone, killed by the oil shock, killed by the fertilizer shock, killed by a war that is generating inflation faster than any policy tool can absorb it. And the precious metals market is confirming the severity of what is happening. The World Bank projected that precious metals prices will increase 42% in 2026 as geopolitical uncertainty fuels demand for safe haven assets. Gold has already crossed $4,500 per ounce. Silver is surging. Central banks in China, India, Russia, Turkey, and Poland are buying gold at record pace for the fifth consecutive year. When every central bank on Earth is simultaneously moving out of dollars and into gold, they are making a collective judgment about the stability of the financial system and the trustworthiness of the institutions that manage it. That collective judgment right now is the most bearish it has been since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. And base metals including aluminum, copper, and tin are expected to reach all-time highs according to the World Bank, reflecting demand from data centers, electric vehicles, and renewable energy. Higher base metal prices feed directly into construction costs, manufacturing costs, and consumer electronics costs. The commodity shock is not limited to oil. It is a full-spectrum repricing of every material input in the global economy, all hitting simultaneously, all reinforced by the same root cause, a war that closed a strait through which a fifth of the world's energy flows. UAE just left OPEC, and Iran is seizing ships, and nobody is talking about what happens when the cartel fractures during a supply crisis. On April 28, CNBC reported that the United Arab Emirates announced it was leaving OPEC starting Friday. That is a sentence that most Americans will scroll past without understanding what it means. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, has coordinated oil production among its members since 1960. The cartel's ability to manage supply, to increase production when prices are too high and cut production when prices are too low, has been one of the primary mechanisms of global oil market stability for more than 60 years. The UAE is one of OPEC's largest producers, pumping approximately 3.2 million barrels per day. Their departure from the organization during the worst supply crisis in history is not a routine diplomatic disagreement. It is a structural fracture in the institution that the world depends on to manage oil supply, and the timing is catastrophic. With 10 million barrels per day already offline due to the Hormuz closure, with global inventories drawing down at emergency rates, with physical crude trading at $130 to $150 in the spot market, the last thing the oil market needed was the departure of a major producer from the coordinating body that is supposed to manage the crisis response. The UAE's departure means they are no longer bound by OPEC production quotas. They can produce as much as they want. In theory, that should be bearish for oil prices because it means more supply. In practice, the UAE's production is constrained by the same infrastructure damage and shipping disruptions that are constraining every other Gulf producer. Their oil still has to get to market. And the routes to market are either closed, damaged, or operating at a fraction of normal capacity. Meanwhile, Iran seized 2 container ships in the Strait of Hormuz last week, as they attempted to cross without authorization, according to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. The seizure happened after Trump extended the ceasefire, which means Iran is enforcing its own transit authority over the strait even during a nominal truce. Iran is attempting to institutionalize a toll system over the world's most important oil choke point. They want to charge vessels for safe passage. Trump has suggested the U.S. could charge its own fees. Both countries are competing for economic control of a waterway that 20% of the world's oil passes through. And while they compete, the oil is not moving. The ships are not transiting. The 230 loaded tankers that were stuck inside the Gulf a week ago are still there. And the oil market is pricing in not just the current disruption, but the probability that the Strait of Hormuz will never return to the uncontested, freely navigable waterway it was before February 28. That is a permanent repricing of global energy risk, and no one is ready for what that repricing means for the cost of everything in America that touches oil, which is everything. Middle distillate cracks just hit all-time highs, and that means diesel and jet fuel are about to become unaffordable. Buried inside the IEA's April oil market report was a technical phrase that most Americans will never encounter, but that will determine the price of virtually everything they buy for the rest of this year. The IEA reported that refining margins temporarily surged as middle distillate cracks reached all-time highs. Middle distillates are diesel fuel, jet fuel, and heating oil. The crack spread is the difference between the price of crude oil and the price of the refined product that comes out of the refinery. When crack spreads hit all-time highs, it means the cost of turning crude oil into diesel and jet fuel has never been higher in the history of the petroleum refining industry. And diesel is the fuel that runs the American economy. Every semi-truck on every interstate runs on diesel. Every piece of farm equipment runs on diesel. Every freight train locomotive runs on diesel. Every construction crane, Every excavator, every concrete mixer, every ambulance, every fire truck in rural America. When diesel crack spreads hit record highs, it means the price of diesel at the truck stop is going to climb to levels that make every product transported by truck more expensive. And in the United States, approximately 72% of all domestic freight is moved by truck. The American trucking associations have documented that the cost of diesel is the single largest variable expense for trucking companies after driver wages. When diesel climbs to $5.50 or $6 per gallon, which is where the current crack spreads and crude oil prices are pointing, the fuel surcharges that trucking companies pass to their customers increase by 40 to 60%. Those surcharges show up in the wholesale price of every product that moves on a truck, which is nearly every product in America. And the jet fuel component of the middle distillate crisis is going to hit Americans who fly. Airlines hedge their fuel costs, but hedging only delays the impact. It does not eliminate it. Delta, United, American, and Southwest will all face materially higher fuel costs in Q2 and Q3, and those costs will be passed to passengers through higher ticket prices, reduced routes, and the elimination of unprofitable regional service. The Americans who live in smaller cities served by regional carriers will see their flight options shrink and their ticket prices climb by 30 to 50%. And the heating oil component means that the 5 million American households that heat with oil, concentrated in the Northeast, are facing a winter 2026 to 2027 heating season where the cost of filling their tank could be double what it was last winter. Double. For families that were already choosing between heat and food, cumulative supply losses have already exceeded 360 million barrels and global inventories are approaching emergency levels. The IEA quantified the total damage in their April report with a number that puts the entire crisis into perspective. Cumulative supply losses exceeded 360 million barrels in March and were projected to reach 440 million barrels by the end of April. For context, the IEA member states coordinated a strategic reserve release of 400 million barrels on March 11th, the largest in history. The cumulative supply loss in just 2 months has already exceeded the entire strategic reserve release. The world burned through its emergency stockpile, and the hole in supply kept growing. Exports through alternative routes, from the west coast of Saudi Arabia, from Fujairah on the UAE's east coast, and from the ITP pipeline running from Iraq to Turkey, increased to 7.2 million barrels per day, from less than 4 million before the war. But the overall loss in oil exports still exceeds 13 million barrels per day. Alternative routes are replacing barely half of what was lost, and with shipments through the Strait averaging only 3.8 million barrels per day compared to more than 20 million before the crisis, the math is simple. The world is consuming approximately 104 million barrels per day. The world is now producing approximately 97 million barrels per day. That is a deficit of 7 million barrels per day that is being drawn from inventories. 7 million barrels per day, every day, coming out of storage tanks that were not designed to sustain drawdowns of this magnitude for this duration. Every oil storage facility on Earth is being depleted at an accelerating rate. And when strategic and commercial inventories fall below minimum operating levels, the physical shortage becomes visible. Gas stations run dry. Refineries cut throughput because they cannot obtain crude. Airlines cancel flights because jet fuel is unavailable at any price. And the price mechanism, which is supposed to balance supply and demand through higher costs that reduce consumption, fails because the consumption it is trying to reduce is not discretionary. Americans do not drive to work for fun. They do not heat their homes for entertainment. They do not eat food grown with fertilizer by choice. The consumption is structural. It is built into the design of American life, and when the oil that supports it becomes physically scarce, not just expensive but physically unavailable, the American economy does not adjust gracefully. It fractures along the lines of infrastructure, geography, and income that have been invisible as long as oil was abundant. Those lines are about to become very visible. And the people standing on the wrong side of them, the people in rural communities without transit alternatives, the people on fixed incomes without budget flexibility, the people in food deserts without local agriculture, will bear the largest share of the cost of a crisis they did not create, did not vote for, and were never adequately warned about. And the EIA documented one more detail that connects every section of this video into a single devastating picture. Before the conflict, their assessment was that the global oil market was oversupplied and global oil inventories were building quickly. The market was heading toward a surplus that would have pushed oil prices lower, not higher. DXY was trending toward the $1.56, gas was trending below $3. The pre-war trajectory was toward cheaper energy, not more expensive energy. The war did not disrupt a tight market. It destroyed a loose one. It took a market that was heading toward abundance and wrenched it into the worst shortage in history in a matter of days, and the oversupply that existed before February 28th was consumed within weeks. The buffer is gone, and the market is now operating in a fundamentally different regime, where every additional day of disruption draws directly from operational reserves that refineries need to function. The EIA noted that they expected the well-supplied market would keep prices from exceeding $100 per barrel if the conflict was resolved quickly. The conflict was not resolved quickly. The ceasefire collapsed, the talks failed, the blockade escalated, and the EIA has revised their forecast to $115 because every assumption that underpinned their original forecast was proven false. The World Bank's baseline assumes the most acute disruptions end in May. They will not end in May. The negotiations have failed. The naval blockade is ongoing. Iran is seizing ships. The UAE is leaving OPEC. And oil is at $111 and climbing. The baseline is fiction. The escalation scenario is reality. And the escalation scenario says $115 is the average, not the peak. Share this video with every American you know who drives a vehicle, buys groceries, pays a utility bill, or heats their home. Because the World Bank published their warning yesterday, the EIA published theirs 3 weeks ago. The IEA published theirs 2 weeks ago. And almost nobody has translated what those institutions are saying into the language that ordinary Americans need to hear right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications. No spin, no party line, just the price of oil and the truth about where it is going.